Hey guys, my name is Diana Garcia. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Florida. I'm the founder and owner of Nurturing Minds Counseling and Private Practice in Florida. Okay, so for today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about one myth of vulnerability that I think comes up often. So a lot of times when we think of the word vulnerability, the automatic reaction is like, ugh, like a cringe reaction almost. There's just like a visceral reaction of like, I don't want to be vulnerable. And part of that is because a lot of times we associate vulnerability with weakness. So we hear a lot, vulnerability is weakness. So being vulnerable, putting yourself out there, it's sometimes we think that it is weakness, but the reality is, and that's the myth, is that it's actually the opposite. To be vulnerable, it takes a lot of courage. So the definition of vulnerability by Brene Brown, it's uncertainty, emotional exposure, and risk. So whenever we're faced with those three factors, again, uncertainty, emotional exposure, and risk, and we have to deal with those, that's what it means to be vulnerable, right? So if you think about that, if I have to deal with uncertainty, emotional exposure, or risk, in order for me to do that, I need to tap into a lot of courage, right? So it's actually the opposite. Vulnerability isn't weakness. Vulnerability takes a lot of courage. Any act of vulnerability has to have an act of courage, right? Because if we think of just even a simple example of, let's say I've been ghosted back to back on Bumble, right? And so I've had these horrible experiences and I keep getting ghosted. An act of vulnerability might be, again, uncertainty, emotional exposure is taking the risk to put myself out there again, right? So maybe I decided to take a break from Bumble for a while because I was crushed and I was tired of getting ghosted. But the act of vulnerability, which would take a lot of courage, is to say, okay, I'm going to put myself out there again because it's something that matters to me. So when we're talking about vulnerability, it's really starting to shift the narrative that to be vulnerable is to be courageous, right? And we have to be vulnerable if we want to have true intimate connection with others in our life. And I'll talk about that in another video, but I just want to first kind of really dispel the first myth of vulnerability, that vulnerability is weakness. It's actually quite the opposite. All right, guys, I hope this tip was helpful, or this information, this myth about vulnerability. And the other thing that I'd encourage you to do is check out some of my other videos on my channel. Subscribe if you're enjoying these videos. Share with someone who you think would enjoy this content. And I encourage you guys to continue nurturing your mind, body, and soul, whatever that looks like for you. All right, have a good one.